I wanted to share with you this very decorative project of my Celtic Cross. Here's one I made in copper with a turquoise cabochon glued to the centre. So it's not too hard to do. There's a lot of binding involved, a little bit fiddly, but I hope you enjoy the project. So I'm going to do this in 0.8 20 gauge silver plated copper, and I've already pre-cut my pieces. You need two lengths of about 3 inches, and don't forget, this is the length. If you wanted to make it a bit longer, you cut them longer, and if you want to make it shorter, you cut them shorter, or you want the scrolls and the spirals to be bigger, it'll change, but this is the one I'm making. Then you want two more lengths of 2.5 2.5 inches, and so two of those. They're the crossbar ones, and then one more length around 2.5 inches again, or just under. So we're going to need some 0.4 binding wire to bind everything together, but you could use 0.3 and a little cabochon, or something you can glue to the center. Again, you could use a bead and wire it onto the center. So using the tips of your round nose pliers, create tiny little circles at the very ends of the wire. So this is the 3-inch length, the longest lengths here. So you're going to go little circle on one side, little circle on the other, and just make sure they're going in the same direction, so that they face each other, and also that they're on the same plane. So the 2.5 lengths, these are the crossbar lengths, take those and do exactly the same thing. So if you work in tandem like this, it really helps you. With anything that's repetitive means you sort of do it quicker, and you'll do it in a similar way. So I recommend you do all this to start with. So you should have the circles ready to spiral. So this is going to be where the scrolls are. So create little tight spirals, about 7 or 8 revolutions on each side. Again, you can always change this later, but do roughly about 7 or 8. You want them to be the same length, basically. So this is the two crossbars, and you just roll the wire around itself so it comes in towards each other. So this is going to be the crossbar. Just make sure you keep the lengths or the stems as straight as you can. And these are the longer pieces down the middle stem. Again, same thing. Roll the wire around itself to create those little scroll ends. And don't worry if they're not exactly the same when you put them together, because you can still keep curling them around until they are the same size. So that's what's useful about spirals. So this is your the crossbar and the centerpiece, and just place them together, check they're roughly the same size. One looks a bit longer, so I'm just going to scroll, look to see which is the smaller scroll, and then go to that one. That's about it. I mean, I'm eyeballing everything. I do everything. It's always a bit wonky. And then check that that's the right length for your crossbar. You can choose to have a very long crossbar or a shorter one. It's really, really up to you. So spend a bit of time getting these units ready, and then we're going to start with the binding. So that's roughly how we're going to lay it out, and you can tell that's the right length and the right width and everything. So this center one, this last length, I'm going to make a bigger circle, because that's where it's going to be suspended from. So it's like an eye pin. You want to centralize that circle to the stem. So when you're centralizing it, just bend the wire to a little bit of a right angle, bring it back, and create that circle so that it sits central to the main stem. Make sure that's nice and straight, because this one is going to go down the center of those two. So they've got to sit, those two circles are going to sit at the top and the base of these scrolls. So this is the time where you spend a little bit of time adjusting everything so that it really all comes together and will fit nicely as one unit. So we're going to bind those 3 pieces of wire together with 0.4 or 0.3, whatever binding wire you have to hand. So cut a nice long length, sort of an arm's length, and you could tape all those 3 little wires together with a little bit of masking tape around the center if you want to, instead of holding it all, because it is hard to get started. If you're new to wire weaving or binding, maybe get a little bit of tape it around the center so you don't have to use your hands holding everything, because it is sort of hard to grip the whole lot without it all falling apart. So basically grip the 3 units. They've got to sit parallel together, and then start binding. Don't go too tight, because you want to be able to sort of scooch it up, and then use your flat nose pliers to flatten it down, so that you make sure that those 3 wires don't get all bunched up and bundled up together. You want them to stay parallel and flat. So keep doing a few little wraps and keeping them as close as you can, and then come back with your flat nose pliers, push them up so that they sit close together and flatten them down. So do this in little, parts like this, so that you can make sure you're keeping it as neat as you can. And do leave a little stem at the end there. We'll come back to that at the end. So just leave that sticking out. That's fine. You don't have to finish that off at this stage. So keep it all nice and tight together, as tight as you can. I mean, it's difficult to get it perfect. I always say to myself, well, if it's a bit wonky and handmade looking, that's good, because it's, not mass produced in the Far East, and it's not from mass production. It's from a handmade, and you can see all the little bumps and squiggles. So now we're going to come to the crossbar. So for the crossbar units, get a smaller piece of 0.4 wire and just bind the center. Just a few little bindings around, flatten, make sure that they're sitting again parallel, that the wires are not bundled up and bunched, and then just cut that off. That's just going to help you to hold it as one unit, rather than try and hold it with 2 separate pieces. So make sure that's nice and there's no pointy spiky ends, and you've got one unit there to place on your cross as the crossbar. Right, so now we're going to hold it where we want to position it. So that's completely up to you. It could be further down if you wanted to. And then bind with the binding wire that's already on your main stem. So one direction, and then around, across in the other direction. And that means you've now got that crossbar on. So now you just continue. So it's a question of keeping it flat again, keeping those 3 pieces completely parallel, and just carry on doing a few binds. And then I've just gone straight ahead, so you don't have to watch me. It's rather boring just watching me bind. So I've come to the end now, and I've just got a tail left, and I'm just going to finish off by binding the wire that's left over in between those scrolls, and then I'm going to find a place to flatten it down and cut it off. You could, if you wanted, you could leave about 1 inch and make a little spiral there, and that will be a decorative end, or just do what I'm doing, just cut off the end and just flatten down any pieces that might be jutting out. So for that, you can use your steel block, give it a little tap, not a hammer, just sort of flattening it down. You can use a nylon head of your hammer as well. So I'm coming back to the top piece that's sticking out now. There's about 1 inch on that side, and I'm going to show you what you could do. This is another option, is create a little doubled up end and then spiral that. So create a tiny little spiral out of the extended length at the top, and then curl that in towards the center, top of your cross, and that can be flattened down at the center between those two scrolls or spirals. So that just gives you another little decorative feature and another nice little finish. So there you have that little scroll there. Make sure that's nicely flattened and compacted on top of your binding. So we've still left to do the two side, the crossbar bit, the two sides. So cut another length of 0.4 binding wire, or whatever binding wire you're using. Find the center of that length and connect it to the center of your cross, because that way you've got two pieces that you can use to bind out on each side. So you're just going to be doing exactly the same thing, binding and binding around those two lengths, making sure that the wire is bound close together and neatly, and flattening it down as you go. And that makes it look as neat as you can, because the binding is a feature of this particular cross. I mean, you can do something more organically if you want with bindings. It doesn't have to be so neat, but for this particular Celtic look, I think it looks nice to be bound. So go right up to the very, very end, and once you've got to the end, if you've got about an inch left, or cut it so that you've got about an inch left, you can make another little spiral like you did at the top of the cross, and that gives it a nice decorative feature. You see, I've done one on this side, so I'm now going to do exactly the same on the other side, and it just gives you this. These little decorative details are what make, you know, the finish these pieces. So little doubled up end, and then with your flat nose pliers, grip it tight, and tiny little movements so that the wire stays very close, curling around itself. And you just keep spiraling it up until it comes right up and sits central to those two side scrolls. And then you'll flatten it down with your flat nose pliers. And we'll just give that a tap as well with a hammer, I think, just to make sure everything's stable, flattened, and there's no ends that can, you know, it's not hammering hard. This is literally tapping, because you've got all those very fine binding wires. So literally just tap it down very lightly, and that will be enough. So there's your cross. So you've now got the basis of the cross, but we're going to put a central feature, which can be either a bead that you can wire onto that centerpiece, or I've got a little flat back cabochon, and I'm going to make a little fake setting for it. So I've got the 0.8 wire. I'm going to make a round circle, and just going to check that sits around my stone. It's a little bit too big. So what I'm going to do is cut through, and then put it around the round circular stone and push the wire so that it's molded to the shape, and then I can see how big it should be. So I just squeeze it around and mold it around whatever you're going to set. You know, is it whatever, cabochon, or, and then you can see it's slightly crossed over there, so I'm going to cut it off, and so that it sits flush, the two ends sit flush together, and create, well, what is really, it's a complete jump ring, isn't it? So just make sure it's sitting absolutely flat and flush, and it is the right size, sits nice and snugly around your little stone. And that I'm going to glue to the center of my cross to give it a nice finish. So get some glue. I've used E6000 for this. I find that works really well for metal and wire and glass. So I've glued that on with that outer setting, that outer circle, that ring, and that will have to set now. It's still gluing, so I can't do much to it for another couple of hours. So I'm just going to leave that sit there to, you know, be nice and dry. And then you can just get a chain. There is a tutorial to show you how to create a fastener on my YouTube channel, and also how to create jump rings, and then you can just fit it onto a chain. So have fun making these in different coloured wires and making them your own. Thank you for watching.